92nd Street Y online media is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. This program, part of the Unterberg Poetry Center's 75 at 75 project, features Susan Sontag reading from her work. It was recorded on November 2nd, 1964, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
Whatever fun is to be gotten out of pornography surely is to be gotten out of reading it and not in hearing lectures about it. So I can't promise that this lecture will be as exciting as its title may suggest. And I hope it won't be exciting in that way, because then I won't be able to say what I want to say. I will try to define what I mean, or characterize it. By classical, I should say really the title's a kind of a joke. By classical, I just mean not 42nd Street. I mean things which have some claim to our interest as part of culture as opposed to sociology or journalism. So I'm going to think of as my examples when I'm talking. I'm not going to characterize anything in detail because I assume that's not necessary. Books like de Sade, anything of de Sade, or anything else of that period, d'Inertia, and so on, these great long volumes that were written in France in the 18th century. A modern book like L'Histoire d'Eau, it's attributed to somebody named Pauline Réage. Some people think it's written by Paulin. And I suppose you can think of things like Candy if you want to. I'll explain what I mean by pornography in a moment, but first of all, the adjective in the title just means something having to do with literature in some way, or art in some way, as opposed to a strictly commercial or sleazy product. I mean classical, of course, rather ironically. Now, what do I mean by pornography? That's more important. I don't mean eroticism or art that has to do with the erotic. I want to, perhaps rather arbitrarily, propose a definition of pornography, of what is pornographic, or what the pornographic spirit is, or that type of consciousness which produces works of art that could be called pornographic. I know my definition will seem to some of you arbitrary, and I make no defense of it except to say that it works for me in order to say certain things that I want to about the theme under discussion in these 5 lectures. Therefore, I do not mean simply works of art dealing with the erotic or the sexual. I will rather arbitrarily define pornography as works of art which embody the idea that lascivious or lustful acts or thoughts are inherently immoral. I don't know whether I ought to repeat that or not, because I know it's a bit of a turn on the usual definition. In other words, I'm not saying pornography is immoral. I'm saying pornography. By pornography, I mean works of art which embody or reflect or react to or react against the idea that lustful or lascivious acts and thoughts are immoral. In other words, works of art which directly and without consciousness of a moral judgment against sexual behavior, works of art which without that consciousness embody or depict sexual behavior, I do not consider as pornography in this definition. That includes, let's say, Balinese dancing or certain Indian temple sculpture, and also I think some works of art in the Western tradition, although unfortunately there are very few works of art in our culture which do not embody or reflect or react against the idea that there's something immoral about sexual pleasure. So that's what I mean by pornography. Now, I want to begin by referring or recapitulating some themes in the discussion last week about comedy. The features of comedy that I singled out as relating to the theme of the impersonal, the idea of underreacting, the disparity between an understated feeling and an anesthetized feeling, and a very large, outrageous event, the principle of the deadpan, the idea of there being a character who is a kind of still center in the midst of outrage. And to that notion, I want to add one more thing. It was mentioned to me by somebody after the lecture last Monday. Somebody said that I hadn't taken account of slapstick, for instance, in Max Sennett comedies. I think that what I was saying does apply, can include slapstick, because slapstick, this tremendous movement and physical abuse of characters by each other, seems to me to have the same effect as the principle of the deadpan. It's just the deadpan in another register. One neutralizes emotion by making it perpetual, by driving it along in the same intense horizontal way. And I think that when you see Buster Keaton, for instance, in a movie like The Navigator or The General, where he is a figure on the whole completely in repose in the middle of the turbulent events, or see him in some of his earlier movies, the shorter films like Cops, where he's running all the time, where he is continually agitated. You see that the principle of continual agitation or perpetual motion in very violent slapstick and the idea of the deadpan as represented in figures like Keaton and Chaplin most beautifully really does amount to the same thing. It amounts to the deadening or neutralization of emotion, and further, as I talked about last time, the putting at a distance of the audience's emotions, of the ability to identify in a humanistic way and bring moral judgments and so on about situations of violence. Now, I want to begin today by making what seems to me a very strong and important connection between pornography, in the sense in which I've defined it, and comedy. It seems to me that this connection can be made in several different ways. First of all, simply in the matter of form. Now, I'm thinking here chiefly of literary works, as you'll see. The typical form of pornographic writing seems to me parody. de Sade's favorite literary form is clearly parody. He's parodying a certain kind of moralistic fiction, let's say that of Richardson, Pamela, Clarissa, in which virtue triumphs, in which a heroine preserves her virtue amidst many temptations, or in which, in the case of Clarissa, a blackguard, a cad, a seducer is finally reformed or taught the evil of his ways. Throughout de Sade's hundreds of volumes of books, of plays, essays, and so on, there's a continual awareness, obvious awareness of other forms of discourse which he sees himself as inverting, as parodying. But he relies, or he evokes in his readers a sense of those forms, whether it's this kind of sentimental novel of Richardson, or whether it's the moralistic discourses on nature of the 18th century philosophers. But all his forms are takeoffs, they're parodies upon already existing forms. And even the characters themselves, I think, make very obvious reference to these forms in de Sade's narratives. His characters, many of them, they're clearly divided into the virtuous and the wicked. And the wicked, of course, always teach the virtuous the folly of their ways. The virtuous characters always pretend to believe in innocence, in kindness, in devotion, in chastity. And this gives de Sade an opportunity to parody and to ridicule these beliefs. Precisely by allowing characters to mouth them in this very sententious way, he can then parody the beliefs and provide what is a very superficial kind of ideological confrontation in his works. In fact, it's very interesting if you read large quantities of de Sade, which I hope a lot of you have done, how much of the books are taken up with this kind of discussion, of a parody of a philosophical discussion of the relative merits of virtue and vice. And lots of other works that can be brought under this label of pornography as I've defined it, works which have which are not innocent, which have this consciousness of the idea that lust or a sexual excitement is immoral or is considered immoral. Lots of works, it seems to me, or typically take the form of parody. A movie which I became interested in last year and wrote about, called Flaming Creatures by Jack Smith. I want to say that I want to include it in this lecture with an extra caveat, because I testified at the trial of that movie to say that it was not pornographic, and of course I do not think it is pornographic by any ordinary legal sense, any ordinary legal meaning of that concept. I only mean it in the special, perhaps rather perverse sense that I'm using it here. It is concerned, Flaming Creatures is concerned with sexuality, and it is immensely parodic. It is immensely concerned with parody and with burlesque of very established images of sexual, of erotic excitement. Many of them actually, of course, taken from kitsch art, Maria Montez movies or von Sternberg movies, like the ones with Dietrich, like The Devil is a Woman. This movie, Flaming Creatures, is full of quotations, and its reliance upon quotation as a medium for making a statement about sexuality seems to me precisely evidence that it belongs in the category of works that I want to discuss here, these works which are not innocent, which are not celebrations or statements of the fact of eros, of the reality of eros, but are on another level and have to do with our troubled consciousness about eroticism. Vampire movies, too, another kind of literature which Flaming Creature parodies. It's constructed as a series of evocations or parodies. Similarly, Candy, the novel by Terry Southern and Mason Hoffenberg, is so obviously a parody that it's hardly worth mentioning, and from its very title, which is a clear reference to Candide, right through all the details of its construction. It isn't just the story of the sexual adventures of an innocent girl, but it is a story very much based on literature, taking off from the literary experience or the literary consciousness of the erotic fact. And one more example of this kind of parodic literature, which I want to include as dealing with pornography, not being exclusively that, but dealing with it in the sense of pornography that I mean, is Buñuel's movie L'Âge d'Or, which we all had a chance to see, most of us for the first time, at the New York Film Festival a couple of weeks ago. I think that this movie makes particularly clear the connection between eroticism and the comic as it's made on the level of pornography, in the sense that I'm defining it. Most of the directly erotic scenes in that movie evoked a great deal of laughter from the audience, and I think we're meant to evoke laughter. The rolling around in the gravel in the garden toward the end, with Gaston Modeau playing the frenzied lover who never seems to achieve his end. The marvelous satire on de Sade, Takeoff on de Sade, which involves a figure who looks like Jesus emerging from the castle after 120 days of orgy. The initial passages in the film about the scorpions, which I think set the theme of the film. It begins as a kind of botanical a zoological, rather, a documentary with a voice coming over the soundtrack narrating something about the behavior of scorpions, and then moves on to images of religious figures of the founding of the city and then of the lovers. I think that a detailed analysis of that film would be a very good illustration of the connection between comedy and eroticism on the level of pornography. Now, the connection between the comic and the pornographic seems to me can not only be made on the level of form, the form being parody, but also, even more obviously, on the level of content. For instance, there is in pornography no real characters. There are no real characters. There's no real development of character. Or if there is character, it's kind of instant character. It's people being exactly what they are, stated in a very simple way, and continuing in that way throughout the narrative. People are, in pornography, are humors or types, just the way they are in comedy. Also, there is the same lack of development of character, the same refusal to attribute to characters any insides or feelings. For instance, in de Sade's narratives, Justine, for example, in one of de Sade's most famous books, most readable books, because it's not as long as most of the others, whatever happens to her, Justine is always astonished. She never learns anything from her experience. Experience teaches her nothing. She's always there at the event, and the event is really very much the same, and it is repeated again and again and again. And this is very similar, for instance, to Candide, who never learns anything from experience. He's a cipher, a blank. We always see the characters in pornography from outside. We always see them behavioristically. By definition, we cannot see them in depth with any real dimensions. And of course, along with this is the fact that they really have no emotions, that the basic tone of pornography is affectless, is emotionless. These characters either have no feelings, or as in many of de Sade's narratives, they are explicitly enjoined to renounce feeling, as the vicious character will tell the innocent victim who's about to be subjected to unimaginable sexual experiences, renounce your feelings, don't feel anything. See? This is the point, it seems to be a tremendous point of intersection between the spirit of comedy and the consciousness that is expressed in pornography. Also, pornography tends to be extremely abstract. There is really no, just as there are no characters, there really are no scenes either. In de Sade, the orgies, or any important or typical pornographic narrative, the orgies take place in no particular time, in no particular locality, just in the same sense that there really aren't living people taking part in them. And there's no development. People are frozen in perpetual attitudes. The beautiful victim is always abject and tearful and pleading that it not continue, and the lustful torturer is always poised over her or engaged in the act which is violating her. But it's a perpetual tableau. Even though things do happen, really nothing happens, because everything is repeated again and again and again. And this principle of repetition, the lack of development in the sense that development leads to consummation or to completion, is singularly absent in pornography. Again, a further comparison between pornography and comedy. Whereas in tragedy, we believe in the reality of suffering, we believe in the reality of death. In fact, this is what, in one sense, tragedy is about. It's a very stylized representation of suffering and death as real and as ultimately arbitrary. In comedy, there really is no such thing as death, and of course, there really is no such thing as suffering either. that violates the kind of consciousness, the kind of detachment that goes into comedy. Of course, it's true in some comedies, there is the prospect of suffering at the end in certain kind of punitive comedy, for example, Johnson's Volpone, or the end of The Merchant of Venice. You have the prospect that the offending character within the comic universe whose expulsion is required by the demands of order, that he will be punished, Mosca, Shylock, and so forth. But their suffering, of course, is not represented, therefore it's not real to us in the same sense that the deaths of all the victims played by Alec Guinness in Kind Hearts and Coronets isn't real to us. So there isn't any real death in comedy. There isn't any real suffering. It's all theatrical. It's all feigned. It's all put on, and we always know it. And those of you who were here last week may remember that I made the point that sometimes, as in films like Dr. Strangelove or Kind Hearts and Coronets, or The Great Dictator, the unreality of suffering is even underscored by increasing the theatrical element and having different roles, morally opposed roles, played by the same actor. Now, this feature of comedy seems to me paralleled in pornography, that also there is no real suffering and there is no real death, and that's why they don't really end, and why, in fact, a number of the very great works of pornography have been so interminably and boringly long. Many of de Sade's novels are 2,000 and 3,000 pages, and there are many novels of the period, for example, Dinercia, run to 7,000, 8,000 pages. I mean, books of 20 volumes long. Now, how can they be so long? They can be so long because there's no principle of completion, because they're based on the principle of perpetual repetition. Nobody's ever exhausted. Nothing ever really happens, and therefore it happens again and again and again. Whereas the whole idea of tragedy is that something really does happen. The hero does die. He does fall. The house falls. The catastrophe happens, and things are not as they were before. Tragedy is based on the style. The subject of tragedy is the stylized representation of a radical change, whereas in comedy, precisely nothing does happen. In pornography, nothing does happen, and therefore they can be interminable or open-ended in this way that they so often are. It's also interesting to think of the fact that de Sade, who had very interesting political ideas and played an interesting role in the French Revolution as a political figure of some small importance, was violently against the death penalty, which doesn't seem to be, on the face of it, consistent with his advocacy of brutality, of the most open expression of physical terrorism between people, among people in the sexual act. But he was against the death penalty, which leads me to imagine, perhaps this is a little fantastic, some kind of underground connection between his political ideas on the one hand, this feeling that the death penalty was so cruel, so horrible, and his willingness to accept torture and violence on the level of fantasy, which he embodied very little in his own life, but of course very much in this enormous literature which he produced. The death penalty, the guillotine, was real and final, and there wasn't anything after that, but the kind of things that people do to each other in the novels of de Sade have no finality whatsoever, and even when people are literally ripped to shreds by various orgiastic acts, just as in Candide, when Candide is flogged by the 10,000 Bulgarians, so in de Sade there's always somebody who comes along with a magic ointment or puts the person to bed, and the next day or the next week, at any rate the next paragraph, the victim who has been near death is completely healed and sewn up and ready for new outrages. This notion of perpetual motion is exactly the conception of the orgy in pornographic literature. And of course, all pornographic literature tends toward the orgy. It tends toward this indiscriminate and continuous group sexual venture. One of the characters in Juliet says, describing a particular scene, in the midst of describing it, and saying that at this moment he's having 15 or 20 orgasms in a row. And then he says, and this is so absolutely typical, "Never did the multiplicity of my pleasures exhaust me. My ejaculations were as tumultuous and abandoned the 10th time as the first." That is not to be understood as bragging, although obviously a certain point of view it is. But the way I'm proposing that we understand it in this context is as a very necessary part of the form of pornographic consciousness, or the form of fantasy that goes into pornography. There cannot be any exhaustion. There cannot be any change. Each experience, by definition, must be the same as any other. It's not that he wants to boast, or the characters want to boast of their prowess. It's simply that the experience must always have the same character, and it must be indefinitely repeatable. Now, obviously, then, pornography is not realistic. The point of pornography is that it's not realistic. And it's, of course, rather naive that if people go to this kind of literature, or encounter this kind of literature, and are surprised, as some people I know have been, that it isn't in fact the way things are, that people aren't so varied or so inexhaustible. But what we're dealing with here, is what I want to suggest, is a certain kind of stylization of experiences for certain purposes in reaction to a certain kind of consciousness about sex, which is guilt-ridden, which is anxiety-ridden, and the notions of guilt and anxiety using or evoking or maximizing in the person a sense of their individual responsibility in the act. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that the rhetoric of guilt in Western culture, the guilty feelings about sexuality, have had a great deal to do, or inextricably connected with the rhetoric of individuality, of individualism, and that when we feel guilty about sex, that's a cultural we, because things are changing and vary from person to person, what we feel is ourselves as individuals. We feel on the spot. We feel it's our own egos wanting this thing or responding in this way that are guilty, that against whom a charge of sin or whatever can be brought. And in order to transcend or escape or modify or forget the guilt or anxiety too about sexual performance can take the same form, where what you feel is your own individuality. You don't feel yourself as an instrument of the life force. You feel what you yourself as a person can or cannot do. We overcome, or we transcend, or we evade the guilt or anxiety by having fantasies about the erotic as an impersonal activity, as a transpersonal activity, as an activity which has nothing to do with us as persons, with people as persons, but rather with people as objects. As I've said before, of course, I think this is apart from our own the mutilations of sexual feelings that we inherit in our own culture, and our reaction against those, that of course there is an element of truth in this regardless, that sexual feeling, like all, I would say, very intense feelings, or feelings at their most intense, feelings of love, feelings of desire, the kind of feelings that go into religious ecstasy or artistic creation, that these typically do in all human beings involve a transcendence of one's sense of oneself as an individual self. What you get in pornography is, I think, a special case of that normal feature of sexual or erotic feeling, an exaggeration of it, because not only are we feeling that and do we respond to that as it's represented in literature, because that's in the very nature of erotic feeling, but we respond in addition because we are driven to escape or evade or want to contradict or transcend the kinds of anxieties or guilts that we have about sex that are part of our culture and not necessarily part of all cultures. Now, I want to just say a little bit more now about this notion of taking a person as an object, as you find it in literature about sexual experiences. It seems to me very, very clear in de Sade, who is the great source, I think, of almost anything that one would want to say about the kind of consciousness that goes into pornography, because his is the great body of work. And all other works, he's not the most distinguished writer of this kind of literature, but he has covered just about all the possibilities. And in de Sade, you see repeatedly, polemically, conscientiously, the idea of the person as a thing, or the person as an object, of the body as a machine, and of the orgy, the sexual encounter, as really an inventory of the possibilities of a machine, or two machines, or several machines in collaboration with each other. And de Sade's intention on a certain level is just to neutralize sexuality of its personal associations, to try to represent an impersonal kind of sexual encounter. Of course, it's all phony, because at every moment he makes us aware of, at least in the form of parody, of the other attitudes which are possible about sexuality. And he makes us continually aware of the outrage of certain of the members participating or being forced to participate in this activity. It's hard to imagine a fantasy of de Sade's, a narrative de Sade's, which doesn't include somebody being terribly outraged and protesting. If everybody is agreeable, as sometimes actually does happen, then one of the characters has to step aside and say, somebody doesn't think this way, or I remember when my mother said to me, or I remember a friend who felt, and tell an anecdote about somebody being outraged. But the figure of the outraged person, of the person who protests, who represents the attitudes which condemn this activity, always has to be represented. On another level, where the physical aspect of sexuality is not directly represented, but it seems to me the spirit of pornography, of the pornographic experience of eroticism, is perfectly transcribed. Another work is La Close, Les Liaisons Dangereuses, which I think is one of the very greatest French novels, one of the greatest novels, and it's very Sadean in its feeling, although it doesn't represent sexual activities directly. But in the relationships among the characters, particularly the two seducers, Valmont and the Princesse de Merteuil, there is an ideology of treating people's wills, not bodies here, but wills, as things to be manipulated. And the grand image or metaphor in La Close novel is of the sexual encounter as a battle, as a military operation in which one plans the strategy in exactly the same impersonal sense, moving units of troops or of materials about. The other important element, it seems to me, in pornography that might be added to this is the democracy of sexuality, of sexual experience, which all pornography tends toward, the obliteration of distinctions or discriminations. De Sade, of course, has many passages in his works in which he talks not only about total sexual freedom, but total freedom of taste in the sense in which he defines it, which means to have a taste for everything. As he says, revulsions are absurdities. They are defects of feeling. All meats are made to nourish man, he says in one passage where he's advocating cannibalism and saying one shouldn't distinguish between eating people and eating animal flesh. And this principle that all the revulsions are absurdities, that all appetites are of equal value, we can see this translated out in the chronic bisexuality of all pornographic literature, its refusal to distinguish between the sexes or to make any kind of, allow any kind of sexual preference to remain final, just as even the unit of the couple, of course, is one that is always challenged in pornographic literature. Now, I want to go on after having done, I hope, two things. One, described the function of pornography in the sense in which I've defined it and its relationship to the impersonal, insexual impulse and its the particular drive or motive which creates this literature in our culture. And Chinese, let's say Chinese or Indian erotic literature has an entirely different character and I don't think can be called pornographic in this sense at all. What I've tried to do is to talk about what pornography is in those two senses and further to talk about it in relationship to the comic. I want to go on now by connecting it with some other phenomena in contemporary culture which may not seem so obviously or explicitly belonging to this character because they're not long and elaborate analyses or descriptions of sexual encounters. The main example of a type of consciousness or artistic movement that I want to give that continues the impulses of pornography is Surrealism, which I'm thinking, of course, both as a literary movement and as a movement in the plastic arts, and of course to a limited extent also in films and theater. Surrealism has been defined many ways. One of the most effective ways, I think it's Breton who said this, is that it's a programmatic search for techniques of estrangement. What surreality, Breton says, is a function of our will to be completely estranged from everything. Now, what I understand that notion of estrangement or alienation to be connects with what I've been trying to say about detachment or non-involvement. It involves a certain stance. It proposes a certain stance toward human situations, toward objects, toward encounters, toward people, at which the emotional charge is muted or leveled off, and in which a kind of democracy or equality of objects, of experiences, of persons appears. In other words, it is very strictly or literally a function of distance and of perspective. When Lautréamont proposed this, what is probably the most famous definition of surrealism, the fortuitous encounter of an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissecting table, what he meant, I think, is to show us directly, as a poet would show us, this idea that on a certain level, which is initially that of shock perhaps, but is intended, I think, to result in a kind of fascinated numbness, the equality and the possibility of the exchange or interrelationship, or one could almost say, following this image, of copulation among the most disparate kinds of objects. They're on a dissecting table instead of on a bed. All objects are on the same plane. They are in that sense dehumanized because our human experience is that level of our experience which makes distinctions, which distinguishes between human and non-human and different degrees of the human, and those humans who are near to us and real to us and those who are simply abstract to us. But on this type of consciousness and this level of consciousness, things are dehumanized, human beings become things, or equally or conversely, things can be animated or treated as human beings. They are affectless, they are numb. I think that one of the famous images of surrealist consciousness, Dali's limp watch, is a very effective transcription of this idea, as if going limp is in a way losing that quality which makes it a watch and therefore different from other things. It's kind of resignation, renunciation of its essential quality. when, of course, I say that things in the surrealist consciousness that we know from novels, certain novels, particularly French novels and visual arts, is dehumanized or without affect, without strong charge of emotion, I don't mean thereby to say they are completely neutral, because what replaces the ordinary gaze or the realistic gaze is a kind of fetishistic, glazed fascination whereby things take on all sorts of weird qualities and intermix and overlap with each other. There's a kind, in surrealist painting, I'm thinking of people like Max Ernst or Balthus, or many, many other painters could come to mind. There is a definite feeling of a kind of erotomania, a kind of fascination toward the object, at the same time a stripping away of any kind of realistic or human function or distinction that the object has. I think that surrealism is very much based on a certain relationship to the erotic. It's based on a discovery, a certain way of discovering or experiencing the erotic so that it explodes in the landscape, so to speak. The erotic is experienced as the impersonal, and people are transfixed into something impersonal, and objects themselves assume this weird fetishistic personal quality. And of course, I mentioned Buñuel before. One can see many details of this in his films, and not only in the one that I mentioned, L'Âge d'Or. And in one of the most marvelous novels that belong in this tradition, L'Histoire d'Eau, you see precisely the working out of the full implications of this idea of a fetishism toward objects and a complete transcendence of the idea of personality, a dehumanization of the woman whose name simply is O. She's not given any further name, as she progresses toward her own extinction as a human being and her own fulfillment as a sexual being. What the pornographic literature does is precisely drive a wedge there, division, where in ordinary life one hopes such a wedge need not be driven, that one does not experience one's sexual fulfillment as distinct from or opposed to one's personal fulfillment. But clearly, insofar as sexual experience represents a kind of an obsessive degree of attention, it does contain elements whereby we experience ourselves as losing ourselves, and the literature that goes from de Sade to surrealism capitalizes on that, and it isolates that and makes us aware of that, invites us to participate in it. And of course, in addition, we all have this kind of experience all the time in dreams, and for that reason, that surrealism has so often been described as an art of the dream, or an art which works out principles of the dream. The dream is simply that type of consciousness that is available to all of us, whether we're artists or not, whereby we do experience things in this impersonal way. Typical experience in dreaming is this strange independence and equality and change of accent and value that objects have, a kind of feelinglessness with which we might witness all kinds of outrageous events in dreams. The characteristic of dreams that we all know is that the accents of emphasis and of emotion are placed in very peculiar ways that we don't recognize. Some things that seem to us so ordinary and trivial in our daily consciousness become matters of tremendous terror in dreams, and on the other hand, in dreams we often watch or participate in outrageous or terrifying events with very little emotion. Also, of course, in dreams we never really die. We experience our death, but then we're always there experiencing it and even experience what comes after us, what comes after the death, which is just as it is in pornography and just as it is in comedy also. And lastly, I want to draw into this tradition a kind of literature that is being practiced, particularly in France right now, some of what goes under the name of the new novel, and particularly the writings of Robbe-Grillet, and writers like that, I guess Robbe-Grillet is the most familiar, who have developed a certain kind of behavioristic rhetoric for the novel in which very minute details, particularly dimensions, surfaces, and colors, and positions down to inches or centimeters rather of objects in a room or in an environment are described, and which people simply function in this measured, described, behavioristically cataloged environment as additional objects moving among the other objects. The style of Robbe-Grillet, the feeling of Robbe-Grillet's novels seems to me a direct, although very abstract, continuation of the aesthetic that goes into pornography, with its determined emphasis upon the object, upon describing things from the outside, and upon varnishing the whole environment with an even coat of fascination. The same fascinated stare can be applied to the distance between two glasses on a coffee table as might be applied to the gesture or the action or the word that is said by one character to another. It's a stare of fascination. It's a fetishistic stare. I don't think it's at all accidental, of course, that one of Robbe-Grillet's best novels is called Le Voyeur. It is about somebody who watches and does not participate, because I think the ultimate fantasy that is involved in pornography is in fact not at all participating, but watching, because only in the watching can you preserve this absolute distance, this fantasy of distance and of non-involvement. So then it seems to me that pornography relates to the impersonal, the pornographic tradition, that kind of literature which goes into works of pornography and the sophisticated inheritors of this spirit that we get in the new novel and in Surrealism, that it is really the obverse side of a sensibility which treats sexuality or sexual pleasure as a subject of moral seriousness, as something one can be serious about within the framework of moral seriousness, and bring a moral judgment against. If pornography, as I've suggested, has something to do with the comic, then it is in reaction to a certain kind of seriousness. It is a kind of debunking of an attitude which is continually being presupposed. So far as pornography contains simply straight representations of eroticism, for example, it seems to me that Fanny Hill, or a good bit of Fanny Hill, most of Fanny Hill, I should say, really isn't pornography in the tradition that, and the way in which I've been defining it, because I think that I don't know how or why this is possible. I'm not attempting any kind of sociological or historical explanation, but it seems to me a remarkably innocent book. It is an erotic book, but it is a book which does not as much seem to be arguing against anything as it is just presenting in the way that, say, many novels and stories in Chinese and Japanese literature do the adventures of a courtesan, the adventures of a prostitute. It parodies within the framework of the story. It tends toward parody or toward humor, whether consciously or unconsciously. I'm not trying to underestimate, of course, the extent to which one can seriously be excited or enter into an erotic relationship, a relationship of erotic stimulation to works of art like this. But I think also what is surprising is how easy it is to be detached. And I'm sure that many of you have watched stag movies or blue movies or seen photographs of that kind. And you know that it's almost like an optical trick, that you can take it seriously in some way or be fascinated by it, especially if you haven't seen it at all. But then there's a certain moment in which you can stand back and it appears hilarious. And of course, one can overdo this. I've seen people react with instant hilarity because they're afraid to experience anything at all at first. But I think any repeated exposure to this kind of literature, or whether it's films or pictures or whatever, it tends to produce detachment, tends to produce numbness, and then can, for some people, be actually comic. At any rate, it seems to me to be anesthetizing much more than it is eroticizing in the sense of being arousing. And indeed, that is exactly its intention. Because I think it is a type of, so far as pornography can be considered as an adjunct to sexual behavior, or something that people really go to in order to stimulate themselves sexually, it seems quite clear that they can only use this stimulus and allow themselves to be aroused at the same time that, in a certain way, they are being anesthetized. It's a very limited or self-mutilating or self-canceling kind of stimulus. And that's why it so often is experienced as comic. One does simply laugh if one is not feeling lustful at the time that one watches a pornographic film or reads a pornographic book. Very often, one's reaction is that of hilarity. And it's not because sex is funny, which it can be too, but because the detachment that is promoted by this kind of literature is so powerful. And this is exactly what indeed it does intend to do. It's not realistic. It is meant to be realistic. It doesn't work on that level. It's not designed to meet problems which could be, or to create experiences which could be created by a realistic representation of the erotic or the sexually exciting. I want to finish today, I don't have too much longer, by talking about something that's a little different, but it seems to me, I hope, connects with what I've been saying, and I'm not sure I can get it in anywhere else. And it has to do with an idea about art which lies behind what I've been talking about thus far and what I want to go on talking about. When I say that art, like all profound levels of human consciousness, is connected with an experience of the personal, of an experience of the transpersonal, of the it, as opposed to the I, of that which cannot be subsumed under moral categories, as distinct from all that can, or the level of human experience that can. I'm obviously proposing a standard which would I think, widen our experience of what art is, of what is acceptable among works of art, and would somewhat change the scale of values that we often bring to works of art. It seems to me that every relationship or every experience that is valuable to us does include an element of shock, does include an unveiling of something that we had not suspected, that we did not know was there. I don't mean at all now necessarily shock connected with the erotic or the experience of sexuality, although that might be one instance of it. But every relationship or every experience in our lives, in our encounters with each other, in what we make and what we do and what we think, that is valuable, that is creative, that is important to us, includes an element of shock. And I would like to emphasize and to sponsor and to stand up for the shock, because it seems to me that it has not been properly defended, and that too many people have emphasized the continuities in our experience and not stood up for this and not known how to defend it, or if they have defended it as a kind of necessary evil or defect. I think that a great work of art, like a great experience on any level, is one that keeps us from intimacy with it and what it is about, as much as it allows us intimacy or invites us to intimacy. It keeps us at a distance as much as it lets us in. You see this in literature very often in a kind of impersonality in the very narration itself, and the way in which a story is manipulated to inform us about some things, to keep some things from us. In the novels of James, for instance, who's not a writer one would ordinarily discuss in this context, that the famous style of James seems to me just this, to function in this way. He obstacles himself. He keeps himself at a distance from his own insight. He refuses simply to know, but in those famous, endless, exhausting sentences in the later novels of James, he makes it hard to know. He makes it hard to come to a consciousness, to a knowledge of what he's talking about. And I think all great works of art, like all great experiences in our lives, throw up obstacles. They make it hard for us. And then what we know, what we attain, what we get to is at a certain cost. And there is a moment when we break through, when there is this shock or this revelation or this unveiling, but it's never complete. We're always somewhat frustrated. And I think that works of art which appropriate reality too easily, which betray the mystery or the ungraspable element in things, are less satisfying, are less interesting. I'm in effect proposing this as a kind of standard, a very loose standard. I don't think that just as human relationships are exhausted when people possess each other too easily or too fully or too completely in too quick a way, so a work of art is exhausted that we can possess too easily or too quickly, or too rapidly. It must hold back. It must always hold back something from us. The novelist, let's say, or the artist is in some sense, of course, a visionary, a voyeur. He's a know-all, he's a see-all. But what he must communicate to us, what the artist communicates to us, is the intractability of the thing, the fact that it cannot be completely known. And he must make us, the artist must make us feel that that the representation of things does involve a certain risk, that there is a kind of trespass on being that is represented by making things appear, by making things visible and concrete and tangible to us. And if the artist dares to do this, then he must make this trespass, this breach of being, as making things appear and appropriate and available to our appropriation. He must make this significant. He must show us in some way that he knows what he's doing, that the work is under control, that he does not think that all the difficulties of knowing the thing that he represents to us can be easily surmounted. And he must keep the spectator or the audience, the person with whom he communicates, who is involved in the thing that he has created, he must keep the audience somewhat at a distance to prevent this dangerous sympathy, this too easy sympathy, which makes the work collapse. Now, I think that the artistic traditions that have arisen out of what I've been calling humanism, and the artistic traditions that have arisen out of humanism very much can be comprised in the notion of realism, that realism does run the danger of a too quick or a false sense of intimacy with persons and places. At any rate, it certainly seems true, as far as I'm concerned, with most of the contemporary representatives of realism. So that what I think is that the artist has to find his own techniques of restraint, and he has to accept, his audience has to accept these techniques of restraint. Because, again, to have this lightning, this moment of revelation, the poles have to be charged, and there have to be poles. There has to be some kind of distance to traverse, as opposed to this rapid transit communication of realism, where things are laid out for you and where you are given or allowed to understand that what is presented to you is the whole picture, is the complete image. In realisms, our sympathies are evoked too quickly, and I think at the same time exhausted too quickly. That the intimacy that we're invited to have in a great many cases is a false intimacy. It's an intimacy based on a kind of spiritual triviality with respect to experience. Therefore, in art, what I have found myself responding to, and what in a way these lectures are very much concerned with, is the sorts of works of art which do allow or make room for the experience of the other or the incomprehensible, what perhaps used to be called, although I can't use this word anymore, and I can't use this word, I think very few people can anymore, the divine. Divine being simply an older word for the other or the non-human. The art that interests me is an art that refuses to simply fall into our own circumference, the circumference of our ordinary human experience. I say this because I hope that I'm not being misunderstood when I talk about going beyond humanism, when I include in the canon of works that are of interest and to be respected such very different things as Buster Keaton or de Sade or whatever. I'm not proposing that the art of insensibility or the principle of not reacting to one's experience or not reacting on a human level to other people is a principle which should guide us on all levels of our existence. But I do think it's one that most of us in our own ordinary ways of thinking or about or reflecting consciously about our experience have not sufficiently made a place for. And I would like to try to translate some of the movements in contemporary art which have aroused so much interest. In literature, the concern with violence, with extreme forms of sexual behavior, with insanity, with absurdity, and so on. One can find equivalent art forms and traditions in the plastic arts, in the film, and the theater. I would like to transfer modernism in the arts into another context or another perspective, where we're not so much concerned or interested or worried by, perhaps, preoccupied by the interest of modern art in extreme states of experience and in outrageous or immoral forms of behavior, but where we might experience this as a necessary corrective and as a valuable and humanly important corrective for much too narrow psychologically and morally narrow vision of human experience. If it sounds strange to our ears when somebody like Lawrence says, I'm not interested in egos, I'm not interested in personalities, I'm not interested in what my characters are in an everyday way, I'm interested in the it in my characters, which is something Lawrence did say, I think, to Aldington in a letter. We have to understand that cry or that complaint, which on a certain level is rather difficult to grasp, as a reaction against a much too trivial, if I were a Marxist, which I'm not, I would say bourgeois, humanist conception of character, in which the it, or the impersonal, or the other, or that which is mysterious, that which cannot be appropriated, has been legally ruled out of existence, although of course it has never ceased to exist. And it's for that reason that we have the aberrations, or the concern, or the focus, I think, with aberration that is so dominant a part of contemporary literature. And I would hate to think that in reaction to the fact that we don't like to be thinking about extreme or unpleasant states of consciousness at every moment, we would be tempted to go back to the kind of realistic psychology which seems, in the light of contemporary experience, to be so untenable, so superficial. Pornography is of interest in this context, I think, not because of its value as literature, because that impulse has no necessary literary or artistic value, but because, if we're honest, I think we can see the attraction that we all have to this way of looking at sexuality. We can see its correspondence with ourselves, and then in works of art which really count and which are really important, which I want to talk about, mainly literary things, in the next two lectures, we will not be distracted by the content and can pay more attention to the form and impulse. I'm not at all, of course, suggesting that de Sade is a great writer, or that most of the writers that fall strictly in this tradition are great writers. They could be, but they just happen not to be. But Rimbaud is a great writer, and Genet is a great writer. And I think that much of what goes into the kind of violent reaction against the human experience, the individualized experience of human experience that is found in pornography, is in a great deal of serious avant-garde modern literature. It's for that reason that the Orville Prescotts and the J. Donald Adams of this world object so much to it. And if we're going to rescue it and take it seriously, it can't be because we then want to deny that it's about what it's about or it has the connections that it does. We rather have to go back, I think, and rescue the other stuff, take pornography seriously as an understandable and important and legitimate expression of a certain kind of consciousness to which we can even find heirs in things like the New Novel or Surrealism. Okay.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y, Unterberg Poetry Center webcasts, and access to our archive are made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. For more information on 92nd Street Y and all our programs, please visit us on the web at 92y.org. This program is copyright 1964 by 92nd Street Y.